Tragedy and Hope. A History of the World in Our Time by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 19. The Denouement of the Cold War, 1957 to 1963. Two revealing events in the late summer of 1957 offer conflicting evidence of the nature of the Soviet system. On August 26th, the Kremlin claimed its first successful test of an ICBM. A month later, it announced that the sixth five-year plan had been scrapped and would be replaced by a new seven-year plan for 1959 to 1965. The meaning of this second announcement was difficult to evaluate, but it showed the regime's increasing difficulty in carrying out its grandiose economic projects, a difficulty that arose from the failures of the Soviet agricultural system. The state of collective farms used such quantities of equipment and manpower, and gave such limited production in return, that they became the chief limiting factor in the Soviet efforts to raise standards of living, to maintain the size and power of the defense forces, to win over third states by economic and technical assistance, and to lead the United States in the conquest of outer space. The output of food from the small private plots of the Soviet peasantry, which were presumably worked only in their owners' spare time, produced 4 or 5 times the output per acre of the state and collective farms. This was, of course, an indication of the success of private enterprise as a spur in the productive process, a fact which was specifically recognized by Khrushchev in a series of speeches early in 1964. But in 1957 to 1959, this meaning of the change in the Soviet economic plan was unrecognized, or at least disputable, and the world's attention became riveted instead on the Soviet success with its rocket boosters. From October 1957, over a period of 5 years, the Russians showed the way in outer space to the United States. In the newspapers and consequent world opinion, the margin of the Soviet superiority seemed much greater than it was in fact. On October 4th, Sputnik 1, weighing 184 pounds, was shot into an orbit around our Earth. A month later, Sputnik 2, weighing 1,120 pounds and containing weighing 1,120 pounds and containing a living dog, also went into successful orbit. But on December 6th, a much-publicized effort by the United States in Project Vanguard failed in its attempt to place a small sphere of 3 1/4 pounds into orbit. On the last day of January 1958, the first American spacecraft, Explorer 1, weighing 31 pounds, successfully was shot into orbit around our Earth. But it was followed by another failure of Vanguard and a failure of Explorer 2 in the next 2 months. In the spring of 1958, our success with Explorer 3, 31 pounds, and another failure with Vanguard were followed by the successful Sputnik 3, 2,925 pounds. The 2 years, 1958 and 1959, saw many American failures in space, 20 in all, mingled with 16 successful efforts, mostly in 1959. In January 1959, the Soviet government put Sputnik 1, 3,245 pounds, in orbit around the Sun 5 months after our first lunar probe had failed. In September 1959, Sputnik 2 hit the surface of the Moon, and a month later Sputnik 3 passed around the Moon, photographing its hidden side. In 1960 and 1961, the United States launched numerous successful space vehicles that gathered valuable scientific information. One of these, in January 1959, made the first broadcast from space, relaying messages from American ground stations. but in April and August 1961, Soviet vehicles successfully sent the first human beings into space. Vostok 1 was recovered after a single orbit, and Vostok 2, after 18 successful trips around the globe, was recovered the next day. These first space travelers, Major Yuri Gagarin and Major German S. Titov, returned safely to Soviet soil, descending to Earth in remarkable demonstrations of the Soviet success in controlling their space vehicles. The first American astronauts, Captain Alan B. Shepard, Jr., who made a suborbital flight of 117 miles in May 1961, and Colonel John H. Glenn, who orbited the Earth 3 times in February 1962, were recovered by landing in the ocean. In October, United States Navy Commander Walter M. Schirra made a similar landing after a smooth countdown and blast-off at Cape Canaveral, now called Cape Kennedy, and 6 orbits around the Earth. These American achievements were seen on television by millions of viewers and roused considerable praise throughout the world at the courage of the American government in permitting live broadcasts of what could have turned into humiliating fiascos. The Soviet fiascos in space developments, if any occurred, were all concealed, while their successes continued to astound the world at the end of 1962. In August of that year, the Russians in less than 24 hours blasted off Vostok 3 and Vostok 4, each with a human passenger, brought them within 4 miles of each other in space, and landed them together, 6 minutes and 124 miles apart, after several days in space, most of it in a weightless condition. This achievement was remarkable for its exhibition of control of the whole process, since 2 vehicles were in almost identical orbits, almost came together in space, and broke all previous records for time and distance in space. Major A. G. Nikolaev circled the Earth 64 times, covered 1,625,000 miles, and was weightless for almost 4 days, during which he worked, ate, slept, and moved about in his capsule. His companion cosmonaut, Lieutenant Colonel P.R. Popovich, made 48 orbits around the Earth and was weightless for almost 3 days. These achievements in the Soviet space program were repeated in June 1963 by similar dual flights of Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, who made 48 orbits, and Lieutenant Colonel Valery Bykovsky, who completed 81 orbits. The impact of these Soviet space spectaculars on world opinion was tremendous. To many neutrals, and even to some in the Western nations, their exploits seemed to indicate that the Soviet Union had moved to first place in ability to apply science to technology, in ability to apply science to technological development. Only gradually, and never completely, did realization spread that the Soviet Union, by announcing only its successes and concealing its failures, gave a misleading appearance of success. In time, it also began to appear that while the Soviet Union unquestionably had tremendous boosters and an almost unbelievable accuracy in firing them, the United States space effort included a greater number of attempts, in much greater variety and size, and yielded immensely larger amounts of scientific information. By 1963 to 1964, when the space rivalry had entered upon a race to place men on the moon, and both sides were beginning to have doubts about the wisdom of this, or at least the wisdom of racing to it, it became clearer that the American space effort was larger, sounder, and more fruitful to science than the amazing and earlier exploits of the Soviet Union. But no such process of reevaluation could change the fact that the first men in space were Russian, Yuri Gagarin and German S. Titov, in 1961. The Soviet successes in space had a triple impact on the United States, with the final result that the whole movement of American life was turned in a new direction. the psychological impact was the least important in spite of its force. More significant was the influence on American education and economic development. The economic impact of Sputnik and Vostok was such as to direct immense resources through government spending toward research in science and technology. By 1964, after 6 years of its existence, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, had settled down to an annual budget of over $5 billion a year. Sums as large were directed by government sources into research and development in science, medicine, and technology. As a consequence, the whole pattern of American education was changed, and so was the relationship between government and education, as well as between the public and education. The educational system was brought into the tempestuous atmosphere of the frantic American marketplace and was being ransacked from the highest levels down to high school, and even below for talented, trained, and merely eager people. As the demands for such people grew, and their remunerations and opportunities increased, the substantial minority who were not talented, trained, or eager found fewer and fewer opportunities to make a living, and began to sink downward toward a steadily growing lower class of social outcasts and underprivileged, the socially self-perpetuating group of the impoverished. At the same time, within the Soviet Union, similar revolutionary changes were taking place, as millions were called from rural and depressed urban areas to educational opportunities and upward advancement in technological skills and social rewards. The socialist pretenses of equal rewards were gradually abandoned, with increased emphasis on individual enterprise, advancing hierarchies of wealth and power, and disparate compensations for ambition, application, talent, and adaptability. On the whole, as we shall see, there was a development of Soviet and American ways of life, not only in convergence toward each other, but, in a sense, away from life in most other nations. During this period of convergence of the Soviet and American ways toward more highly developed scientific and technological systems, there was, simultaneously, a superficial sharpening of their political struggle, and a less obvious opening of numerous bridges of cooperation between them. Such bridges appeared first in those areas of scientific and educational life where they were developing away from the majority of other nations. It appeared in such a remarkable example of international cooperation as the International Geophysical Year, July 1957, to the end of 1958, and more specifically in the Soviet-American agreements on cultural and educational changes, such as that for 1958 to 1959, signed in January 1958. These brought scientists, teachers, musical performers, industrialists, and even tourists from one country to the other. In November 1958, 2 unconnected events began the process that led in 4 years to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the relaxation of the Cold War. On November 27th, Khrushchev, filled with self-confidence and truculence, sent a note to the Western powers demanding settlement of the Berlin problem, under threat that the Soviet Union, at the end of 6 months, would itself sign a peace treaty with the East German government, would withdraw its own forces from the area, and hand over its rights in Berlin, including control of the Allied access routes into the city to the East German government. Because the Western powers did not recognize the East German regime, this action would not only force such recognition, but would force them to negotiate with East Germany over rights, based on victory and agreement with the Soviet Union, which were not negotiable, particularly with it. When Khrushchev sent this ultimatum on November 27, 1958, NATO had only 21 divisions, 1/3 of them West German, to defend its position in Europe. But the next day, America's Atlas ICBM, for the first time, shot full range of 6,325 miles. While the 6 months of Khrushchev's ultimatum were ticking off, the two hostile camps began to disintegrate internally in Western Europe and in the Far East. In the Far East, the first year of Red China's 5-year plan, the so-called Great Leap Forward, began to collapse within 6 months of its beginning. Apparently, to cover this up, the Chinese government began to adopt a very aggressive attitude toward the nationalist Chinese government on Formosa, Taiwan, and prepared to mount an all-out assault on its forces on the Chinese territorial islands of Matsu and Quemoy, which were still under Chiang Kai-shek's control. The strong support Dulles gave to Chiang, including reinforcement by an American naval carrier task force, and his psychological readiness to go to the brink of war, spread down to all parts of the world. The Red Chinese threat gradually petered out, and they made extensive demands on Moscow for military, technical, and financial assistance. About the same time, France made demands on the United States to prevent any possibility of Europe becoming involved in a nuclear war arising from unilateral American actions in the Far East or elsewhere, in which France had not been consulted. These two demands, from Peking and Paris, soon showed the disintegrative features developing within the two superblocks. Red China's demands for assistance from Moscow could not be met, for the simple reason that the Kremlin could not fill the demands of the Soviet Union itself, caught as it was in a three-way vice of a faltering agricultural system, the increasing demands of the Russians themselves for improved standards of living, and the needs of the missile and space races with the United States. Accordingly, the Chinese-Soviet Technical Assistance Agreement of February 1959 offered only 5 billion rubles over the next 6 years, approximately half the amount that had been provided during the previous 6 years. Within 6 months, Red China began aggressions against its inaccessible borders with China and was making increasingly unfavorable comments about Khrushchev's doctrines of peaceful coexistence with capitalism and the inevitable victory of socialism without war. In the same 6 months, the United States was having growing difficulties with France within NATO. In September 1958, de Gaulle asked that a tripartite directorate be established of the United States, Britain, and France to provide consultation on a global basis wider than the European limited control exercised through NATO. This demand was very well founded, since America's actions in Quemoy, or the landing of American Marines in Lebanon in July 1958, might have led to war with the Soviet Union and a Soviet attack on Western Europe over an area, an issue in which France had not been involved or consulted. De Gaulle's request was rejected. As soon as the imperious general had been inaugurated as the first president of the Fifth French Republic, January 1959, he took steps to extricate France from some of the French commitments to NATO. The French Mediterranean fleet was removed from NATO control. The use of France as a base for nuclear weapons, either from planes or missiles, was refused, and French participation in a unified European air defense system was denied. In two-day talks in Paris, December 19th through the 20th, 1959, the two presidents, Eisenhower and de Gaulle, went over the ground again and reached a stalemate. Eisenhower rejected de Gaulle's suggestion for a three-power global policy directorate, and de Gaulle rejected Eisenhower's desire for an integrated air and naval defense system for Europe. While these positions were developing, a significant turning point in Soviet-American relations appeared during Khrushchev's visit to the United States, September 15th through the 17th, 1959. The Kremlin leader was full of his usual talk of the inevitable future victory of socialism and the need for peaceful coexistence until that time. He welcomed competition in economic or technological affairs, in athletic or cultural matters, but he ruled out the need for war or the legitimacy of aggression by either side. At first, he refused to be impressed with the wealth and power of America, implying that it was not surprising to him and that the Soviet Union could do it better at some future date. But gradually, a very important change occurred. In spite of himself, he was impressed. He ceased to pretend to himself that the things he saw were some special exhibits set up, regardless of cost, to delude him. Gradually, the incredible truth dawned in his mind. Many Americans actually lived like this, in what the ordinary Russian would regard as unbelievable luxury. The real revelation came when he visited farms in Iowa, saw the equipment and way of life of these successful American farmers, and found out the economic statistics of American agriculture at its best. For years afterward, he talked of these matters, and, as recently as April 1964, he told the Hungarians about it and advised them to emulate the American farmers. Khrushchev's journey was notable in other ways. At Camp David with President Eisenhower, he revoked his 6-month time limit for settling the German question on the ground that the consideration of the problem by the Foreign Ministers' Conference of the summer of 1959 had suspended the urgency of the problem. At the meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations in September, Khrushchev won considerable support for his suggestion that the Soviet Union was willing to reach complete disarmament supervised by mutual controls, including aerial photography. During his visit, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko provided a curious glimpse into the intricacies of the Soviet system. At Camp David, he tried to make a deal binding each party to limit its propaganda radio broadcasts to the other to 3 hours a day, with the unstated implication that Moscow might stop jamming the Voice of America if this agreement was reached. Although our broadcasts in Russian, at that time, were only 3 hours a day, we refused the offer by saying that we wished to increase, not reduce, the flow of information. Gromyakov left with the impression that the jamming was an expense and burden on the Soviet system. At any rate, in June 1963, with the relaxation of the Cold War, jamming was stopped by the Russians without any agreement. The weakening of the Soviet position, which the Kremlin recognized in regard to missiles in 1961, also appeared to them in other fields, and was fully apparent to anyone who wished to look at the comparative prosperity of the two superblocks. Nowhere did this comparison stand out more clearly than in divided Germany, and nowhere could the Kremlin accept it less readily. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the contrast between the East German Democratic Republic and the West German Federal Republic were as between night and day. The West, with about 55 million persons, was booming, while the East, with less than 17 million, was grim and depressed. The West German economic miracle was based, as we have said, on low wages, hard work, and vigorous pursuit of profits by private enterprises, little hampered by the government or labor unions. It was in fact the closest example of traditional 19th century laissez-faire that the mid-20th century had to offer. The government, under the influence of Minister of Economics, later Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, operated in terms of what they called a socially conscious free market economy, soziale Marktwirtschaft. But the play of free economic forces was to be found in lack of interference by the government and competitive wage rates, rather than in price competition among industrial producers. The fluctuations of the business cycle were dampered down by the government's fiscal policy, and it was said that possible inequities in the distribution of the national product could be remedied by a progressive income tax mild enough not to interfere with incentives. Otherwise, taxes were drawn to encourage industry to plow its profits back into the business rather than to raise wages. This policy, and the national tendencies of the German outlook favored production of capital goods over consumer goods, and for the export market rather than for domestic use. After 1945, labor unions, which had been closely associated with political activities and with agitations for drastic economic and social reforms before the Nazi regime enslaved them, sought to avoid politics and to concentrate on wages and work conditions, as do unions in the United States. But these activities in Germany had traditionally been the concern of other agencies, such as work councils, and they could hardly be much influenced by unions in a period of surplus labor and low prices, such as prevailed in Germany in the 1950s. This surplus of labor in West Germany came from the influx of 13 million refugees into the area, chiefly from East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Once the boom started, the demand for labor was so great that refugees continued to be welcomed, and at least 2/3 of a million non-German unskilled workers were imported from Italy, Greece, Spain, and elsewhere in southern Europe. The docility and eagerness to work of these peoples kept wages low, profits high, and the boom going through the 1950s and into the 1960s. As late as 1960, only 38,000 man-days of labor were lost by strikes and lockouts in West Germany, compared to almost 500,000 in the Netherlands, 3 million in the United Kingdom, and 19 million in the United States in that year. Some of these consequences of this system, besides the most obvious one of booming prosperity, were that the structure of monopolized industry with great rewards for the upper classes, with lesser rewards and little social mobility for workers, continued in the 1950s, as it had been in Germany since its industrialization began. In 1958, 8 great trusts still controlled 75% of crude steel production, 80% of raw iron, 60% of rolled steel, and 36% of coal output. The number of millionaires in marks more than doubled in 4 years in the middle 1950s, yet less than half of the eligible workers were in unions. Union membership went up only 20%, while the working force increased 67% after 1949, and only an insignificant part, 5% of university students came from the working class, compared to a rate 5 times as high in Great Britain. To the outside world, and to most Germans, especially East Germans, the inner nature and structure of the West German economic miracle was of little significance. What did matter was that the average West German had steady work at adequate wages and limitless hope for the future. The 10% increase each year in the West German gross national product was something that could not be denied or belittled. Among those who had no desire to ignore it or belittle it, but, on the contrary, were eager to participate in it, were the East Germans. They continued to flee westward from poverty and despotism to plenty and freedom. Every effort made by the communist regime to stem that flow merely served to increase it. The more police who were sent to guard the frontier between East and West Germany, the more police there were to flee westward with others. The reasons for these flights to the west were clear enough. East Germany has been a Stalinized regime under an unpopular tyrant who is sustained by 22 Russian divisions because he is willing to administer East Germany as an economic colony of the Soviet Empire. In spite of Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalinism, he supported a Stalinist regime under Walter Ulbricht, the communist dictator of East Germany, because that type of regime extracted the largest booty from its territory for the Kremlin. This pressure became worse on East Germany just after 1959, when the attractions of West Germany became greater, and the endless demands of Soviet resources for missiles, space spectaculars, improved standards of living, and a disintegrating agricultural system were increasing. To fulfill these demands, East Germany scrapped its unfinished second 5-year plan in 1959 and switched to a 7-year plan synchronized to the Soviet Union's new 7-year plan for 1959 to 1965. As part of that plan came a forced collectivization of the half of East German agriculture that still remained in private hands. In 3 months, February through April 1960, almost 1 million farmers were forced into less than 20,000 collective farms by methods of violence and social pressure similar to those Stalin had used 30 years earlier in Russia. And the consequences were, in an economic sense, very similar. Agricultural production collapsed. Shortages of food were soon followed by other shortages, especially of coal. As might be imagined, the East German winters of 1961 to 1963 became grim nightmares. The 7-year plan of 1959 proved almost at once to be unfulfillable, and was replaced by a new and more modest one for 1964 to 1970. But the area's subordination to Russia was hardly eased at all. East Germany, like the rest of Moscow's European satellites, is organized into a unified system of industrial specialization and economic exploitation, the Comecon, Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, the Soviets' version of a common market, set up in opposition to the Marshall Plan in 1949. As a consequence, 80% of East Germany's exports go to communist countries, and it became the Soviet Union's largest customer by supplying 20% of its total imports. Generally, this exchange took the form of Russian raw materials exchanged for German industrial goods, especially machinery, chemicals, optical products, and scientific instruments. But the failure of the whole system may be seen in the fact that East Germany, whose pre-war industrial capacity was about as large as West Germany's, by 1960 was producing only 1/4 the industrial output of West Germany. The communist solution to these difficulties was to increase the tyranny, but this simply forced more East Germans to flee westward. To prevent this, and to prevent, if possible, communist knowledge of the great successes of the capitalist system to the west of them, the East German authorities on August 13, 1961, clamped down a rigid death strip along the East German-West German frontier, and hastily built a wall along the line dividing East Berlin and West Berlin. For months, this wall was strengthened and heightened, surrounded and surmounted by barbed wire and watchtowers, with the buildings and concealing places along its length cleared away. Nevertheless, 20,000 persons risked death, injury, and prison, and successfully escaped over the wall in the first 12 months. Since then, the figure has fallen to 10,000 to 13,000 a year, with about 8 to 10% made up of those who were supposed to be guarding it. In contrast with this, the West German economic miracle that made that country the third largest importer and the second largest exporter in the world, with freedom and prosperity, was more than Khrushchev could stand. West Berlin, which shared in the freedom and prosperity of the West, in spite of the fact that it was surrounded by the grim penury of East Germany, was even more objectionable to Khrushchev, because it was a glaring exhibition of the success of the West and the failure of the East. As Khrushchev himself said, West Berlin was a bone stuck in my throat. There can be little doubt that Khrushchev's talk about peaceful coexistence and the inevitable triumph of socialism by competition without war was sincere. He was convinced that the Soviet Union, as the sole earthly representative of a communist regime, must be preserved at any cost. He, with his associates, since the testing of the first successful Soviet thermonuclear explosion in August 1953, have recognized that a thermonuclear war would have destroyed all civilized living, including the victors. The Red Army at times, and Red China always, objected to this, with the argument that enough would survive to permit reconstruction of a socialistic way of life. But Khrushchev was not persuaded. On this basis, he sincerely wished to divert the communist-capitalist struggle into non-violent areas. Thus he was sincere in his disarmament suggestions and negotiations. But since he distrusted the Western powers just as thoroughly as they distrusted him, any advance along the road to disarmament was almost hopeless. The Soviet position sought limitation of nuclear arms and long-range vehicles, and was much less willing to accept limits on conventional arms or ground forces. This is equivalent to saying that he wished to limit the United States and was reluctant to limit the Soviet Union. Only after 1959, with the increased strain on the Soviet Union's economic manpower, was there any readiness to curtail infantry forces. At the same time, the almost insane secrecy of the Russian system made the Kremlin reluctant to accept any effective kind of inspection of disarmament, which was almost automatically regarded by them as espionage. The United States was even less eager than the Kremlin to reach any effective disarmament agreement, since, unlike the Soviet Union, most of the pressure from American economic and business circles were in favor of the continuation of large defense spending, the source of a major segment of America's employment opportunities and industrial profits. Only at the beginning of 1964, when President Johnson astutely sought to combine reduced military expenditures with reduced taxes and a large-scale attack on American domestic poverty to expand demands in the consumers' markets, did it become possible to dissipate some of the opposition to reduced arms expenditures from the military-industrial complex. Accordingly, the Soviet disarmament proposals of April 30th, 1957 were discussed month after month, and year after year, with minimal progress. By 1959, it was quite clear that the Kremlin's chief aim was to prevent Germany and Red China from getting nuclear weapons. Accordingly, they concentrated on efforts to direct the disarmament discussions toward restrictions on nuclear testing and on nuclear-free zones in Central Europe and in Asia. The nuclear-free zone in Central Europe, which fitted in well with a British-favored policy of disengagement in that area, was known as the Ripaki Plan, after its nominal proponent, but reappeared in various versions for many years. There can be little doubt that a central role in Soviet foreign policy was played by the Kremlin's not unjustified fear of Germany and its almost neurotic opposition to a unification of Germany that was not under Soviet control, or to the acquisition by West Germany of nuclear weapons. A stalemate on this subject was ensured by America's refusal to accept the status quo of a divided Germany because of our devotion to the Adenauer regime, and our fear that West Germany, rebuffed by us on the issue of reunification, might prefer reunity to prosperity or democracy, and make a deal with the Soviet Union to achieve such unity. This we could not accept because of our conviction that German infantry forces were necessary to the West European defense system if there was to be any hope of defending Europe against Soviet ground forces on any level of combat below all-out thermonuclear warfare. For these reasons, the United States committed itself repeatedly to the Adenauer regime to work for the unification of Germany on democratic lines. Moreover, in 1957, an Eisenhower commitment to Adenauer subsequently expanded into a formal declaration of Berlin by the three Western powers, July 29, 1957, stated that any comprehensive disarmament agreement with the Soviet Union must necessarily presuppose a prior solution of the problem of German reunification. A series of bitter disappointments during the 4 years 1958 to 1962 led the Kremlin to the desperate decision to move part of its RIBMs to Cuba. 3 factors may have played significant roles in this reckless decision. In the first place, the inability of the Soviet Union in 1961 to overtake the American lead in ICBMs made it seem necessary for the Kremlin to seek to remedy some of its deficiencies in these long-range weapons by deployment closer to the United States of some of its larger supply of IRBMs. Moreover, increasing evidence that the Soviet Union could not compete successfully with the United States in such nonviolent areas as agricultural production, raising standards of living, or aid and technical assistance to neutral nations, made it seem necessary that the Soviet Union seek some method of increasing its military and political pressure on the United States that would, at the same time, give a boost to its prestige throughout the world among neutral or sympathetic states. Finally, the growing recognition that the Soviet chances were dwindling for reaching the kind of settlement it wanted in West Germany or West Berlin undoubtedly led many in the Kremlin to conclude that a successful emplacement of Soviet missiles in Cuba, even if there were no real intention of using them, could lead to a compromise settlement under which these missiles would be removed from Cuba in favor for a Berlin settlement, more favorable to the Soviet desires. Whatever the reason for the Soviet missile buildup in Cuba, once began in August 1962, it proceeded with amazing speed. The White House was suspicious by the beginning of September, and by the 24th of that month, President Kennedy obtained from the Congress permission to call up 150,000 reservists. But aerial photography did not show missile placements until October 15th. Soviet high-altitude AA rockets, SA-2s, had been identified in Cuba in August, and Ilyushin-28 jet bombers in September. The week of October 14th through the 21st was one of steadily increasing crisis within the United States government, although no public announcement was made before the President's speech of Monday, October 22, 1962. This speech established a quarantine on all offensive equipment under shipment to Cuba, demanded dismantling of the missile sites, and withdrawal of Soviet forces under threat of stronger action by the United States, and announced that any missile launched from Cuba against any nation shall be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring full retaliation. The effects of this speech were explosive. To the world it began 6 days of crisis, in which the two superpowers hung on the brink of nuclear war. In reality, the situation was quite different. The crisis, in fact, was an almost perfect example of a diplomatic crisis, and of how such a crisis should be handled. The pattern for a classic diplomatic crisis has 3 stages. 1. Confrontation. 2. Recognition. And 3. Settlement. The confrontation consists of a dispute, that is, a power challenge in some area of conflict. Stage 2 is recognition by both sides of the realities of the power relationship between them, always much easier when only 2 states are involved. And Stage 3 is a yielding by the weaker of the two, accompanied by an effort by the stronger to cover that retreat by refusing to inflict a humiliation or obvious triumph over the weaker. As Metternich said, a diplomat is a man who never allows himself the pleasure of a triumph, and does so simply because it is to the interest of the stronger that an opponent who recognizes the victor's strength and is reasonable in yielding to it not be overthrown or replaced by another ruler who is too ignorant or too unreasonable to do so. The crisis of October 1962 was conducted along these lines in a masterly fashion by President Kennedy, except for a few minor blemishes caused by some of his subordinates. The power situation throughout the missile crisis was overwhelmingly in favor of the United States, by at least a 4-to-1 ratio. The Kremlin could do nothing to defend Cuba if we attacked it, since its missiles and jet bombers there were not yet ready. Moreover, the Kremlin could expect devastation of the Soviet Union itself if it pushed the Cuba project. It was a mark of Kennedy's masterful analysis here that he ignored Cuba and made the crisis a simple USSR-USA confrontation. In doing so, he placed the issue on a pure power basis and made rubbish of the clutter of unrealities accumulated on the American foreign policy scene since 1945. NATO, our allies elsewhere, the United Nations, and the Organization of American States were not consulted before decision in action. They were informed afterward, chiefly on October 23rd. When informed and asked to back the White House, they could neither decide nor act. The dominant fact in the whole situation was the overwhelming character of America's power, and the fact that this was known both to the White House and to the Kremlin, but was largely unknown and certainly unpublicized to the world. Around the Soviet Union's border were 144 Polaris, 103 Atlas, 159 Thor, Jupiter, and Titan missiles, 1,600 long-range bombers, many of them constantly in the air with nuclear bombs. When the president's speech began, the public crisis, 5 divisions of the United States Army Strategic Reserve, totaling about 100,000 men, plus 100,000 Air Force, and an equal number of naval and marine personnel, had been mobilized or alerted. The 1st Armored Division had been flown from Texas to the East Coast. 90 naval vessels, including 8 carriers, were on patrol to blockade. A Cuban invasion command had been assembled in Florida, and 2,700 relatives of military personnel had been evacuated from Guantanamo. Under the pressure, Khrushchev wilted. It might almost be said that he panicked on Friday, October 26th. Only 8 days before, on October 18th, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko had made a personal visit to the White House, and without mentioning the Soviet activities in Cuba, had threatened Mr. Kennedy. The Soviet Union was unable to postpone any longer the conclusion of a peace treaty with the East German Democratic Republic, yielding to it control over the access routes to Berlin. The president had listened and dismissed the foreign minister without saying anything about the missile buildup in Cuba, which was already under discussion within his government. But a week later, the world could think of nothing else except the missile buildup and the American response. As Washington waited for the Kremlin's reaction to the president's speech, work on the missile sites continued. Soviet vessels were approaching the American naval patrol around Cuba, and the American government was approaching its allies, the UN and the OAS. Before the public crisis began on Monday, the administration recognized that its blockade was illegal, that the United States itself had once fought a war for free navigation of the seas, and that we recognized blockade only in connection with a declared war. As a concession to this, the American action was called a quarantine, not a blockade. The chief point of concern was, would the Soviets accept it, or would their vessels precipitate war by trying to break through? The test came on Thursday, October 25th, at the end of 3 days of confused activity in other corners of the stage. On Tuesday, October 23rd, as the United States took its case to the UN and the OAS, reactions came from its allies and world opinion. Both reactions were adverse, but most states made it clear that they would not oppose the American action. Although the British government, like the rest of our allies, supported the American action, public opinion in England, including The Guardian, The Times, and the leaders of the Labour Party, flung back at us the criticism the Eisenhower administration had made of the British attack on Suez 6 years earlier. Ignoring the United Nations, deceiving and bypassing one's allies, resorting to violence rather than peaceful procedures in international disputes, and risking nuclear war before negotiations have been exhausted. Pakistan and India, unable to agree on anything else, were united in their criticism of Kennedy's irresponsible exposure of the world to the risk of war. Sweden flatly rejected the blockade. In these same days, the 20 other Latin American states voted to support the American blockade of Cuba, and Argentina offered to provide ships to participate in it. But several states indicated that they would not support an American invasion of Cuba if the blockade failed to enforce removal of the missiles. The United Nations, as might be expected, was not so successful in reaching any agreement. 3 resolutions were introduced, submitted by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the 40 neutrals out of 105 member states. But it was impossible to obtain the necessary 2/3 vote for any one of them, and none came to a vote. In the meantime, for 2 days, the important question hung unanswered. What would the Soviet ships do when they reached the blockade? The first, a tanker, was challenged by an American destroyer on Thursday, was acknowledged, and gave the necessary information that it was carrying no arms to Cuba. Within a few hours, it became clear that 12 of 25 Soviet ships en route to Cuba were turning back. The Kremlin had backed down. The following night, Friday, October 26, 1962, the White House received a long and confused letter from Khrushchev. Its tone clearly showed his personal panic, and to save his reputation, it was not released to the public. The next morning, the Soviet Foreign Office published a quite different text, suggesting that a deal be made dismantling both the American missile sites in Turkey and the Soviet missile sites in Cuba. To those inside both governments, this was recognized as a Soviet surrender, since they knew that the Turkish sites were obsolete and were already scheduled to be dismantled within a few months. Although this would have amounted to giving something for nothing on the Russian side, it was rejected by the White House, because it would have represented to the world a surrender of Turkey, our ally on the Soviet border, because the Kremlin had succeeded in establishing a direct threat on our border. Instead, the White House replied to Khrushchev's unpublished first note, extracting from it an offer to remove the Russian missiles if we would lift the blockade and promised not to invade Cuba. This acceptance was sent off to Moscow on Saturday night, while our mobilization for an attack on the Soviet missile sites, if their construction continued, went on. On Sunday morning, by radio from Moscow, Khrushchev's acceptance was announced. The work on the missile sites was ordered stopped, and they would be dismantled, with UN observation to verify the fact. In return, the President would promise not to attack Cuba or allow our allies to do so. This led directly to the removal and deportation of the missiles and Ilyushin bombers over the next few weeks. The Soviet soldiers and technicians left much more slowly and never completely. Inspection of the sites was prevented by Castro, who was wild with anger at the way he had been brushed aside and finally sold out by the Kremlin. As a result of this failure, the American promise not to invade Cuba was also not given. The missile crisis, by stripping the Soviet-American rivalry down to its essential feature as a crude power rivalry, cleared up a number of ambiguities and opened a new era in 20th century history. It showed, 1, that the power balance between the two superpowers was clearly in America's favor. 2, that the United States government, in spite of Khrushchev's doubts, had the willpower to face and begin atomic war if necessary. 3, that no one really wanted thermonuclear war, and that Khrushchev was prepared to go to any reasonable point to avoid it. And 4. That deterrence actually does deter, and accordingly, that a modus vivendi might ultimately be achieved between the two superpowers.